Mom, starting with your next paycheck, we're transferring all your money to my account. My son said it casually, as if he were suggesting a new coffee brand, his fingers warm around a mug he did not pay for in a kitchen I had kept running with the careful arithmetic of a woman who had lived her entire adult life on the edge of enough. He smiled while he spoke, that soft, managerial smile people use when they want you to believe submission is a gift. I was 62, and the word incapable hung between us without being spoken. I looked straight at him, searching his eyes for a bridge back to the boy I had raised alone, the boy I had fed on overtime and grit, the boy who once fell asleep on my shoulder after bad days and church picnics. There was no bridge, only a calmness that did not include me. I took a long breath, steady as a nurse removing a bandage, and said yes, fine, I trusted him. He kissed my forehead the way a stranger kisses a relative at a funeral, polite, empty, already thinking of the drive home. "It's for your own good," he said, words that lingered in the air like a draft after the door has shut. That evening, as on so many Fridays for so many years, he came back with his wife, letting themselves in with the key I had given him, back when I still believed trust was the same thing as love. Their footsteps passed my living room, the lock turned, the door opened, and then a scream split the hallway, a high, startled sound like an alarm clock I had not set. I did not get up. I was seated at my bare kitchen table in a bare kitchen in a bare house, my hands folded, my heartbeat so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum in the next room, though there was no refrigerator anymore. My son rushed in, his face bleached of color, his wife a step behind him with that polished, chilly composure I had always tried not to see. "Mom, what did you do? Where is everything? Where's the furniture? The television? Where is everything?" I told him, evenly, that I had sold a few things, that I needed cash on hand if he would be handling my finances. The truth sat between us like a small, bright coin. His face went from winter to wildfire, and I watched something tilt inside him, something I had refused to name. "You're crazy," he spat, taking a step forward the way men sometimes do when they want a woman to feel small. "How could you sell things without asking me? How are we supposed to watch television when we come over? How are we going to be comfortable here?" That last question unlocked a door in my mind, and the wind that blew through it cleared the fog of years. We, comfortable, here. Not me, not the woman who had paid the rent with double shifts and dinner plates. The house, to him, had become a lounge he did not have to clean. His wife moved closer, her perfume careful and expensive, her gaze winter sharp. She said I was selfish, that they came every week to keep me company, to make sure I was well, as if kindness could be measured in empty plates and unreturned favors. The word selfish, applied to a woman who had made rice and beans last a month to buy a boy a pair of sneakers so he would not feel like less than the other children, landed with a dull thud in my chest, and then dissolved. My son stood there, calculating, and told me perhaps it had been a mistake to propose the bank transfer. Perhaps I was not in any condition to make good decisions. Perhaps I needed more help than he had thought. Help. Such a gentle word for a cage. I stood up and felt a voice rise in me I had not heard in years. I told them there was no dinner, that if they were hungry they could eat elsewhere. The silence that followed had weight. His wife laughed without laughter, and my son said, very quietly, that I should be careful. A woman my age, alone without family, who truly cared, could end up in a bad way. He said he was all I had, and I should remember that before doing anything stupid. They slammed out, and the engine roared, and the sound receded, and I stood in the echo of my own house and felt something harden that had been soft for far too long. It was not grief that filled me. It was clarity. I sat again and let my eyes rest on the bare rectangle where a couch had once been, on the squares of unfaded paint where framed photographs used to hang, on the open space I had made not for money, but for truth. I had sold the furniture to send a message, to tilt the mirror toward his face. He had replied in the language he knew best, entitlement dressed as concern, coercion brushed as care. In the hush that returned, I remembered nights washing office floors under lights that never slept, Remembered the tiny apartment with the thin walls through which I could hear my son breathing. Remembered the small boy who wanted the same brand of sneakers the other children wore, the way his face had opened like a morning when he saw them on his feet. I remembered the loan I took when he chose a private college, a decade of payments made with the same stubborn patience that teaches a woman how to stand very still when the wind threatens to uproot her. I remembered the years after graduation, when he said he would stay to save money, and I said, "Of course, this is your home." And 5 long years later, he left to buy a house with cash, and I told myself I was proud, because pride was easier than admitting I was tired. The wedding came next, expensive and glossy, and at the reception I sat at a table near the back, smiling with a mouth that did not quite believe itself, while he called the front tables important because that was where clients sat. And I went home that night with my shoes in my hand and a quiet inside me I could not name. After marriage, his visits thinned to a trickle, then settled into Fridays that arrived like bills, on time, assumed, unspoken. He never came empty-handed because he never came with hands meant to carry anything for me. He came with an appetite. I cooked anyway. I set a table like an altar to a memory, even as I began to notice that dinner for them was not family, but service, not conversation, but consumption. Once, after they left, I added up the cost of the meal and felt a small grief at the $15 that would become an extra hour mopping the floor of a lobby that smelled of lemon and fatigue. My refrigerator began to wheeze, and when I mentioned it, he told me to buy a new one, as if $500 was a number that did not bruise. On my 60th birthday, he arrived late with nothing in his hands, ate the cake I had bought for myself so the day would not feel like a hallway with no doors, and left in 20 minutes. That night, I cried the way a dam fails. Slowly at first, then entirely, because I finally admitted the truth I had been rearranging for years. To my son, I was a pantry that restocked itself, a wallet that did not argue, a house that did not close. When he returned with papers spread across my kitchen table like a map he did not intend me to read, he said it was simple. Sign here and here and here. And I read the small print anyway, the tight, careful prose that hides teeth behind syllables. It was not mere access, it was power of attorney, a clean blade that would give him my signature without my hand. I picked up the pen and felt the old reflex tug, the mother's reflex, the surrendering reflex that confuses love with permission. Then I remembered the scream in my hallway, and the red in his face, and the sentence that placed his comfort above my existence. And I set the pen down as if it were hot. I told him I needed time. Irritation flashed, and then he smiled again, the way men smile when they think time will make women agreeable. He left the papers as if inevitability were furniture, and that night I did not sleep. I sat at the table and watched the black pages of the window turn toward morning. I went to the bank at first light, the branch with the tellers who know my name from decades of deposits that never looked like much, but always arrived. I asked for 6 months of statements and read them line by line, the way a woman reads her own palm. There it was, a withdrawal I had not made, money lifted from a different branch with my card on a day I had been at home. My card had never left my purse, except for once, and memory, that patient archivist, brought me the night he had let himself in while I was in the shower, and the purse that sat in the living room while I made coffee. A heat rose in me, not the heat of shame, but of seeing. I asked about details, and the teller said an investigation was possible if I filed a claim. I told her I would think about it, because there is a difference between a fear and a plan, and I was done living inside fear. At home, I opened boxes of old papers and pulled my life into the bright light of my dining table. What we hide from ourselves grows teeth. I found them one by one. There was a credit card I had not applied for, with charges from hardware stores and electronics and home furnishings, the exact shape of a renovation I had admired in his photos, the new cabinets I had praised, without knowing whose name had paid for them. There were medical appointments on my insurance while I was in the hospital with pneumonia, dates and clinics that belonged to someone else's body. There was a utility account at an address that was not mine, opened when he had borrowed my identification to collect a package he said was urgent. Penalties had bruised my credit and explained the small humiliations of the past year, the little denials that made me feel like a child asking permission in her own kitchen. I sat on the floor surrounded by paper and let the world rearrange itself around the truth. It was not confusion. It was not a misunderstanding. It was theft. It was deliberate and practiced and conducted in the soft language of family so that I would doubt my own memory and call it love. That Friday, I cooked his favorite meal, chicken and rice, the comfort I had once placed in front of a boy on the worst days so he would remember he had a home in a world that could be sharp. He ate it with the efficiency of a man refueling a car he did not own, placed the papers beside his empty plate, and told me my days to decide were over. I looked at him and said I needed more time, and his wife's laugh clicked like a bracelet. He called me irrational for selling my own furniture in my own house and told me, again, it was for my own good. I held his gaze until he looked away, because sometimes the only tool left to a woman is silence held long enough that a man hears it. They left without goodbye. I sat in the chair, the papers in front of me like a mirror, and understood that a war had begun, not with shouting or slammed doors, but with records and signatures and the slow, unglamorous courage of a woman who will not sign away her life to keep the peace that is killing her. In the morning, I chose a different kind of courage, the practical kind with paperwork and proof. I walked into a modest office with a brass plaque that read David Chung, Attorney at Law, and sat on a chair that had held 1,000 other people who once thought they were alone. He listened with the attention of someone who still believes the truth matters, his pencil moving only when necessary, his eyes never leaving mine when I reached the parts that tightened my throat. When I finished, he leaned back and said the words I already knew but needed to hear in a steady voice. This was financial fraud and abuse of trust, not a misunderstanding or an awkward family disagreement, and if I signed away my power, I would make the theft legal. He mapped the way forward with a calm precision that felt like a handrail on a dark staircase. Do not sign anything, report the unauthorized transactions, close and replace what can be closed and replaced, change every password and every PIN, lock your credit, document everything, and, if necessary, seek a restraining order not because you hate your son, but because you love your life. I left his office with a folder and instructions and the strange lightness of a woman who has finally given her fear to someone who knows what to do with it. I went straight to the bank and remade myself in small, decisive acts. I changed every code that guarded my days, requested a new card, filed disputes for the withdrawals that did not belong to me, and closed the fraudulent credit line that had been quietly feeding a house that was not mine. The teller spoke to me as if I were capable, because I was, and I walked out feeling taller than the doorway. At the savings branch, the quiet one I had opened 3 decades ago for a dream of a house I never bought, I asked the manager to close my account and hand me a cashier's check. She asked gentle questions, the kind that leave you room to tell the truth or keep your privacy intact, and I told her I was making changes. I took that check across town to a bank where my son had never followed me as a child, opened a new account with a name that was only mine again, and felt something click into place in my chest like a locked window in a storm. From there, I moved through the city with a list and a purpose. The utility company where David's forms and my affidavit unhooked my name from an address I had never slept in. The credit bureau, where a thick report laid out my history like a ledger of daylight and shadow. The disputes for the charges and the personal loan I had never taken. The freezes that would make openings heavier to find for anyone who went looking with my face. In the afternoon, I climbed the familiar stairs to the door of my neighbor, the woman who had watched my son the nights I cleaned offices and who knew by the sound of my footsteps whether I was bringing home hope or exhaustion. Bertha Washington, 70 years strong and still upright with dignity that did not ask permission, opened her door and took my hands the way women do when they mean to hold more than fingers. "You look different," she said, and I told her everything. Not as a plea, but as a record, the same way a person reads names on a memorial so the lost will not be erased. She listened without the tidy reassurances people offer when they cannot bear the truth, and when I asked her to be my witness if anyone tried to paint me as confused or drifting, she nodded once, solemn as a vow. She offered me her couch if I ever felt unsafe, pressed her spare key into my palm without ceremony, and told me she had always admired the way I stood up straight even when I was bending. Back in my apartment, I filed and copied and labeled, building a paper spine for the life I meant to carry forward. I sealed a letter that told the whole story in my own hand and asked Bertha to keep it until there was no need for it anymore. I did not feel theatrical doing these things. I felt prepared. Sometimes safety is not a feeling at all. It is a stack of documents in the right order and a plan you can follow even if your hands are shaking. They came in the middle of the week, the day soft with late light, their car door thudding with the impatience of people who assume doors will always open for them. The bell rang insistently, and I opened the door but left my body in the frame. My son's voice had lost its sugar. He said we should talk inside, and I told him we could speak here. His wife's mouth twisted into something almost like pity, the kind people wear when they want to call you hysterical without using the word. "You are not enemies," I said before she could begin. "Enemies tell the truth about their intentions. Thieves call it love." My son took a step forward and stopped when he saw I would not move. I told him I had the records and the dates and the numbers and the photographs of the statements, that I had spoken to a lawyer, and that I knew about the card, the withdrawals, the utilities, the loan, the penalties that had dragged my credit through gravel. There is a second when a lie realizes it is dying, and I watched it flicker across his face, the scramble, then the calculation. He tried on outrage the way he had once tried on school blazers, claimed I owed him, claimed his childhood without a father had written him a blank check on my back, claimed the sacrifices I made for him had somehow accrued interest he was entitled to collect forever. I told him he was wrong, in a voice so steady even I wanted to sit down and listen to it. I said he had two choices: return every cent and repair what he had broken, or I would take the evidence to the police and the courts and let the public record hold what my heart no longer could. His wife tugged his sleeve and said I had already lost, and I felt a quiet pass through me like a tide. They turned and left, their footsteps loud on the stairs, and I closed my door on the old life without needing to lock it. David called that night with the first returns from the banks and the card issuers, confirmations that my memory was not the problem and that the paper trail matched the shape of my hurt. He told me I had a strong case if I wanted to press criminal charges, and that there was also the option of demanding restitution in a civil action, a step that might invite accountability before the heavier machinery began to move. I sat with the phone warm against my cheek and weighed the soft, treacherous part of me that still believed a private warning might wake the good in my son, against the clear-eyed woman I had finally become, who knew that privacy was the room where he did his worst work. I chose daylight. I told David to file the suit so the truth would stand where anyone who cared to look could find it, not filtered through my son's captions and curated images. Power arrived then, not as triumph, but as alignment, the inner certainty that I had made a choice that did not betray me. The notice went out on a Thursday, and by noon my phone was a little theater of messages, first polite, then pleading, then ugly. The arc of a man discovering that his mother's silence had acquired teeth. He ran, as I knew he would, to the place where he makes his own mirrors. He posted a careful declaration about toxicity and boundaries and the bravery of stepping away from abusive relationships, words that draw applause because they sound like modern prayers, and strangers blessed him in the comments, while people who knew neither of us offered him halos for wounds he had not suffered. I watched without answering. Not because I did not burn at the theft of the story, but because I refused to lend my heat to his performance. Then the machinery of reality began to hum. His lawyers read the file David had assembled and reached out not with threats, but with questions about settlement, a word that meant they had run their fingers over the dates and signatures and found edges that cut. The post stopped. The silence became its own confession. In that hush, people who had once thought of him as the capable son began to ask questions in rooms where I did not sit, and the careful social circle he and his wife had arranged around themselves developed hairline cracks that widened in the pressure of truth. I did not feel glee. I felt the deep, level relief of a woman who has stood in courtrooms of one kind or another all her life, and finally hears the judge say her name correctly. 3 months later, the matter settled exactly as I had prayed it would, not through vengeance, but through truth finally being recorded in ink instead of tears. Bryce's lawyers, perhaps exhausted by the futility of his denial, advised him to sign the agreement that David had so carefully drafted. It demanded the full restitution of $17,000 plus an additional $5,000 for damages and the cost of repairing my credit, along with every cent of the attorney's fees. But there was one clause that mattered more to me than all the numbers on the page, a clause David had first called unnecessary, but which I insisted upon with the quiet resolve of a woman who has learned that silence, too, can be an inheritance. My son had to issue a public statement acknowledging his fraud, confessing in his own name that what I had claimed was true. It was not about humiliation. It was about light. If he wanted to live in the truth, then he would have to stand under it. When the statement finally appeared on his social media, it looked like a wound disguised as formality. It was short, written in careful, lawyerly language meant to sound dignified, but the meaning cut through the polished tone like wire through silk. He admitted to accessing accounts without authorization, to opening credit in another person's name, to committing serious errors in judgment for which he took full responsibility. That phrase, full responsibility, hung there like a flag of surrender fluttering over a quiet battlefield. The comments below were a mixture of disbelief and moral shock, a chorus of strangers and acquaintances recalibrating their loyalties, realizing that the hero they had cheered had built his image on the bones of his mother's trust. For a long while, I simply watched, not for revenge, but to witness the world realigning itself with the truth. The first payment arrived the next week. On time, every digit correct, every line precisely as the court required. And the second followed, and the third, each one landing not like wealth, but like breath returning to lungs that had forgotten how to expand. I didn't spend the money right away. I watched it accumulate in the account that bore only my name. I used to believe safety lived in love, but safety lives in the ability to pay your bills and choose your own company. When the final payment cleared, I made a decision as quietly as one folds a letter. I was done with the city that held my exhaustion. I bought a small house in a coastal town 3 hours away, a whitewashed cottage with a tiny garden and 2 rooms, one for living and one for dreaming. I paid in cash, using the restitution and the savings I had protected from my son's reach. When I signed the deed, I felt as though I were signing my own rebirth certificate. The move was simple. A few boxes, some clothes, the old photographs that still meant something, even if the faces in them had changed meaning. I arrived on a bright morning when the sea smelled of salt and renewal. The house was quiet, except for the gulls and the wind, and I stood in the middle of the empty living room and realized that emptiness, when chosen, can be the purest form of freedom. I filled that space with small things that mattered only to me. Books I had wanted to read for decades, clay pots with blooming geraniums, a wooden chair by the window where the sun lingers every afternoon. There was no television. I had no need to watch someone else's story unfold when mine had finally returned to my own hands. A few weeks later, Bryce called. I saw his name on the screen and felt nothing except the faint curiosity of someone watching a distant storm. I answered, not because I wanted to speak to him, but because I no longer feared his voice. It sounded smaller than I remembered, thinner around the edges. He asked if we could talk, if there was still a path toward forgiveness. His words trembled with something that might have been regret or merely fatigue. I let him finish, and then I spoke the sentence that had been resting in my chest for months. The son I raised is gone. Whether he never existed or simply disappeared along the way, I can't say. But whoever you are now, you must continue without me. He was silent for a long time. Then there was a breath, a sound like a sob swallowed too late, and the line went dead. That was the last time I heard from him. Now, I wake up when my body tells me to, not when duty demands it. I drink my coffee in the garden, surrounded by the hum of bees and the steady rhythm of the sea breathing beyond the dunes. Some mornings, I talk with Bertha on the phone. She still calls every Sunday, her voice strong, her gossip familiar. She tells me I sound lighter now, and I suppose she's right. The weight that used to press on my chest has been replaced by something else. Peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that grows when you finally forgive yourself for trusting the wrong people too long. I spend my afternoons reading the books I once shelved for later, and my evenings watching the sunset bleed over the water until the whole horizon looks like a promise kept. People think victory looks like revenge, like someone begging for forgiveness at your feet. But true victory is quieter. It's the sound of your own breath steady in your chest. It's the knowledge that you no longer owe explanations to anyone who used your love as a currency. I did not win because my son paid me back. I won because I stopped letting him define what I was worth. I stopped being the mother who gave until she vanished. I became the woman who said no, not out of spite, but out of dignity. And that no, spoken softly but with truth behind it, was the loudest, most beautiful word I had ever learned. So this is my life now. A small house, a garden, a sea that keeps its promises. Every flower I plant is a quiet declaration that it's never too late to begin again. If you're listening to this, wherever you are, remember that. Never let anyone convince you that protecting your peace is selfish. It is the highest form of wisdom. And as I sit on my porch with the evening breeze on my face, I whisper a thank you. Not to my son, not to the past, but to myself for finally coming home. The days have fallen into a rhythm so gentle, I sometimes have to remind myself that peace, too, can be real. I wake before dawn because that's when the world feels unmade. The sky is still gray and undecided, the sea murmuring softly beyond the dunes. I make my coffee the way I like it, strong, with a hint of cinnamon, and sit by the window watching the first streaks of light unfurl over the horizon. For years, mornings were a race against the clock, against exhaustion, against unpaid bills and ungrateful mouths. Now they are an invitation. I no longer rush toward anything. I let the day arrive on its own terms, like an old friend who knows I'm not going anywhere. Sometimes I walk into town, to the small market where the same old men sell bread and the same women trade gossip over tomatoes and herbs. They have begun to recognize me, the quiet lady with the soft smile and the tidy gray hair who always buys just enough for one person. They don't know my story, and I don't offer it. Here, I am simply Eleanor, not Mom, not Mrs. Johnson, not the woman whose son betrayed her. Just a woman who has learned to live with her own company and find it sufficient. There is a bakery that smells like warmth and forgiveness, and a tiny bookstore where the owner leaves notes tucked between the pages for readers to find. I read one last week that said, "Some endings are only doors that learn to open the other way." I took it home and pinned it above my desk. In the evenings, when the light begins to fade and the sky turns the color of soft bruises, I sit on my porch with a blanket around my shoulders. The sea wind carries the salt of the world, and I let it rest on my skin. Sometimes I think of Bryce, not with hatred anymore, not even with sorrow, but with a kind of distant tenderness for the boy he once was, the boy who used to run barefoot through puddles and ask me to tell him stories before bed. I do not know where that boy went, but I have made peace with the fact that he is gone. What remains is a lesson carved deep into me. Love without boundaries becomes self-erasure. And once you start disappearing for someone else's comfort, it takes an entire lifetime to find your way back into your own shape. On rainy nights, I write in my journal. I write not for him, not for forgiveness, but for memory, to remind myself how far I've come. The pages hold pieces of my old life like pressed flowers, fragile but still fragrant. There's an entry from the day I stood in the lawyer's office, trembling but firm. Another from the night I moved into this house and slept on the floor with only a pillow and the sound of waves for company. I write about Bertha, who still calls to tell me about her garden and the neighbors' endless drama, and how she ends every call the same way. "Keep your door open to the wind, Ellie, but never to the past." She's right. The past has nothing new to say. Every so often, a letter arrives addressed in a handwriting I know as well as my own. The first time, I couldn't bring myself to open it. I left it on the mantel for days, watching the paper warp slightly with humidity. When I finally did, I found a single page inside. Bryce's words were cautious, almost clumsy. Apologies that didn't quite fit in his mouth. Explanations that tried to soften what cannot be softened. He said he was in therapy, that he was trying to understand the man he had become. He wrote that he missed me, that he still loved me, that he wanted to make amends. I folded the letter neatly and put it back in the envelope. I didn't respond. Not out of cruelty, but because closure is not a door that two people walk through together. Sometimes it's a room you build alone, brick by brick, until the wind can't reach you anymore. I have learned that forgiveness is not something you hand to the person who hurt you. It is something you give yourself so you can sleep at night. I forgive him in the same way the tide forgives the shore, by coming close, then drawing back, knowing that proximity does not mean safety. My forgiveness does not invite him back into my life. It simply releases me from the gravity of his mistakes. That's what survival truly is, not the absence of pain, but the decision not to carry it forward. Now, when people ask about family, I smile and say, I raised a son once. That is all. They don't need to know the rest, and I no longer need to tell it. I've discovered that freedom isn't loud. It's quiet, like the sound of waves folding into themselves at dusk. It's the ability to end a story without bitterness. It's the space you create when you finally stop trying to fix what someone else broke in themselves. Sometimes, at night, I dream of the younger me, the woman mopping floors under fluorescent lights, thinking exhaustion was love. I see her look up, catch my gaze across the years, and for the first time, she smiles. She knows now that all that effort was not wasted. It was just misdirected. The strength that once went into saving others is now building something softer, steadier, and entirely her own. I wake up before dawn, the sky still undecided, and I think, maybe peace isn't something we find. Maybe it's something we finally allow ourselves to keep. There are mornings now when the quiet feels almost sacred. Not empty, not lonely, but whole. The kind of quiet that hums with gratitude. I water the flowers in my small garden, watching droplets cling to the petals like tiny mirrors of light. The geraniums bloom the way I hoped they would, red and unapologetically alive, spilling over the clay pots I chose myself. Sometimes I think about how much of my life was spent making choices that weren't really mine, living according to what others needed from me. A paycheck, a meal, a soft shoulder, a mother who never said no. But these flowers, these walls, this garden, they are entirely of my choosing. Each petal, each small blade of grass feels like a declaration. I am here, and I belong to myself. There's an elderly couple who lives 2 houses down, the Thompsons. Every Sunday they invite me for tea and pie, and I've learned that their kind of love, quiet, enduring, tender, is the opposite of what I once mistook for devotion. They bicker softly about sugar and crossword puzzles, but there's no malice in their words, only the gentle friction of 2 lives long intertwined. When I visit, they always insist I take an extra slice home. Mrs. Thompson says it's because she worries I don't eat enough, but I know it's her way of saying, you're one of us now. It's strange, the comfort that comes from such small gestures, a shared pie, a borrowed book, a neighbor waving from across the fence. It's a different kind of family, one built not on obligation but on choice. Once in a while, the past still reaches out, soft and unexpected. An old photograph falls from a book, or I hear a song Bryce used to hum as a boy when we cleaned the apartment together on Saturdays. Those moments hurt, but not like before. The pain is smaller now, quieter, like a bruise that fades but never disappears completely. I don't fight it anymore. I let it come. I let it remind me that love, even when it fails, still leaves behind traces of its first intention, to connect, to nurture, to make someone feel seen. That reminder is enough. I can miss the boy without missing the man. Last winter, a letter came again. This one longer, written in a steadier hand. Bryce said he had paid all his debts, including mine, and that he was volunteering at a shelter for recovering addicts. He said he thought of me every day and hoped that I was happy. He didn't ask for forgiveness this time. He simply wished me peace. I sat on the porch and read it 3 times. Then I folded it, tied it with a ribbon, and placed it in a small wooden box with a few other things I've decided to keep. My wedding ring, my son's first school drawing, a photograph of my mother laughing in her garden. The box sits on the top shelf of my closet. I don't open it often, but I like knowing it's there. Not because I live in the past, but because I've finally made peace with it. In the evenings, when the sun slides down into the sea and the light turns honey-colored, I talk to myself softly, the way I once talked to Bryce when he was small. I remind myself of what I've learned, of the truths I earned the hard way, that love without respect is a slow kind of death, that boundaries are not walls, they are doors you choose when to open, that letting go doesn't mean giving up, it means giving yourself back to yourself, and that dignity, once reclaimed, tastes sweeter than any apology. Bertha visits me sometimes. She still calls me child, even though we both have silver hair now. She brings jars of homemade jam and news from the old neighborhood, who married, who moved, who passed away. We sit together on my porch in comfortable silence, two women who have lived long enough to understand that peace is not loud and strength doesn't need to shout. Before she leaves, she always squeezes my hand and says, "You did right, Ellie. Don't you ever doubt it." I never do. The sea outside my window has become my clock. It teaches me about rhythm, about surrender, about the beauty of things that return and retreat without asking permission. Some days it's calm, others wild, but it's always honest. I think that's what I craved all my life, honesty, even when it hurts. And the sea, in its endless movement, has given me that gift. It reminds me that nothing stays still, not grief, not love, not even guilt. Everything shifts eventually, and what remains is only what is meant to stay. Now, when I look in the mirror, I no longer see the tired woman who once sat in an empty kitchen, watching her world collapse. I see a woman who built herself back from silence, a woman who learned that self-respect is not pride, it's oxygen, a woman who no longer mistakes endurance for love. I've stopped counting the years I lost and started treasuring the ones that are left, because they are mine, truly mine, for the first time. So if you are listening to this and you have ever been where I was, giving, hoping, shrinking just to keep someone else comfortable, I want you to hear me now. It's never too late to reclaim your story. It's never too late to step out of the shadows of someone else's need and into the light of your own worth. You do not owe anyone your silence. You owe yourself your peace. And as the sun sets, the sky glowing like a memory that has forgiven itself, I whisper to the wind what has become my quiet prayer. May I never again confuse sacrifice with love, nor obedience with kindness. May my heart stay open, but my door stay locked to those who come to take, not to care. The sea answers softly, pulling the tide back home, and for the first time in a long, long life, I am completely, beautifully free. Sometimes, when the wind carries the scent of salt and wildflowers through my window, I think about how long it took me to understand that freedom isn't a single moment of rebellion. It's 1,000 small choices, made quietly, every day. Choosing peace over guilt, choosing solitude over chaos, choosing truth, even when it trembles. The world around me has slowed into something almost sacred. The clatter and noise that once filled my life, phones ringing, footsteps in hallways, the endless hum of needing to be useful, has faded into a softer rhythm. I no longer rush to answer every sound. Not every call deserves to be answered. On warm afternoons, I walk barefoot along the beach path behind my house. The sand is cool and forgiving, and the waves leave fleeting traces of themselves before vanishing into the foam. I collect shells sometimes, nothing fancy, just small pieces that catch the light, and keep them in a bowl near the door. Each one feels like a memory I decided to keep, proof that something broken can still be beautiful when reshaped by time and water. I look at them often and think, I am like these shells. I was cracked open, reshaped, and returned to shore. The neighbors in this town have stopped seeing me as the woman who lives alone. Now they just see me as Eleanor, the one who brings extra cookies to the market stall, the one who helps feed the stray cat that wanders the docks, the one who always has time to listen. There is quiet pride in being useful on my own terms. People trust me with their stories, small confessions whispered over coffee or laughter shared over fences. And each one reminds me how strong the human heart is when it's treated with gentleness. There are nights when I still wake from dreams of the past. I see my younger self, exhausted, waiting by the window for a son who no longer comes home. And I reach for her in my mind. I tell her that she made it, that the pain she thought would consume her became the soil for a new kind of life. I tell her that she can stop fighting to be loved, that she can rest now, and she smiles before fading back into sleep. In the silence that follows, I thank her for surviving long enough to give me this peace. I've come to believe that some love stories aren't between two people. Some are between a woman and her own life, the one she fought for, the one she finally claimed. Mine is that kind of story. It took losing everything I thought defined me to discover that I was whole all along. The love I kept searching for in others had been sitting quietly in my own hands, waiting for me to stop apologizing for needing it. Sometimes the horizon catches fire as the sun sinks low, and the light spills across the water like gold poured by invisible hands. That's when I speak to the sea, not in prayer exactly, but in gratitude. For every hard lesson, every betrayal that stripped me bare enough to start over. For the house that stands because I built it, and for the woman inside who finally belongs to herself. I know now that forgiveness is not a gift you hand to the one who wronged you. It's the key that frees you from the cell they built in your heart. I have forgiven Bryce, not because he asked, but because carrying the weight of him would only slow my steps on this sand. I have no need to rewrite our story anymore. It unfolded exactly as it was meant to, leading me here, to this small piece of earth, to this ocean, to this peace. As I sit on my porch, the last light of evening fading into blue, I realize that life has come full circle. The girl who once dreamed of safety, the woman who endured storms, and the soul who now watches the sea, they are all me, finally sitting together in the same stillness. My heart no longer races with worry. It beats with quiet certainty. I am enough. I have always been enough. So if you're listening to this story, wherever you are, I hope you hear the truth that took me a lifetime to learn. Your worth is not measured by how much you give or how long you endure. It lives in your ability to stand up, to say no more, and to walk away without apology. You are not selfish for saving yourself. You are brave for choosing to live. The sun disappears beyond the waves, leaving a trail of light that softens into dusk. I take one last sip of tea, breathe in the salt air, and smile. My life is quiet now, but in that quiet, there is music, the song of everything I lost and everything I became because of it. And as night settles gently over the sea, I whisper to the wind, "Thank you." Then I close my eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of the waves, and I rest, finally, completely, home.